everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to McDuff Lives. And I'm so glad to have Harley Schlanger back with me to help us sort out what the heck's going on. Harley, welcome. Thanks for joining me again.
Glad to be with you, John. Always enjoy it.
Well, Harley, I surely do too. And it's we basically were on the same page right now. I mean, before I saw your morning video, I titled this show "Can Europe Go It Alone?" And then I saw your title, and I thought, "Wow, we are both looking at the same issue." And let me turn it over upside down, because I think that it's more, to me, it's more sensible to ask or to just say, Europe cannot go alone, can it?
No, there's no way. And you can see the panic if you look at the British press in particular. This morning, Starmer was before the parliament, and Starmer said, no, there's no way Trump is going to cut off the arms shipments to Ukraine. And then, of course, the New York Times reported this morning that Trump had already decided to stop, have a pause, as they called it. And the British media turned on Starmer like crazy and said, where did you get this information? What are you talking about? The attacks on him are escalating. But here's the picture that I think we have to look at. There are two things here that are most important. One is that the cut in arms follows directly what Trump had intended to do if Zelensky did not go along with the negotiation. And Zelensky could have just said, okay, we'll negotiate. But he can't do that for either ego reasons or the pressure on him inside Ukraine. And some of the pressure is from NATO. Now, this brings us to the real question of the reason I think that NATO and Europe can't go it alone. They're insane. They're completely out of reality. They're prepared. I mean, look, the new German chancellor, Merz, who's not even in yet, he announced a 400 billion euro increase in defense spending. This at a point where Germany is in an extreme economic crisis. The debt is growing. There's a deindustrialization. Just today, Bosch, one of the major auto supply companies, announced another 10,000 layoffs this year, coming on top of 12,000 last year. And the CEO of Bosch said the shift from the combustion engine to the electric engine will mean 300,000 job losses in Germany. Are they going to put 300,000 people building weapons? That's the problem they have, and they don't have the money to do it. In England, the United Kingdom, the Starmer's talking about a 3 billion increase in defense spending. Now, England is now at 18% of the population below the poverty level. They're approaching the level of poverty in Charles Dickens' days. And with children, it's 25% of the children in Great Britain live under the poverty level. So they're going to cut more out of social spending, more out of healthcare. The National Health Service is broken down. And then Macron is in huge trouble. If you put Starmer, Macron, and Merz together and add their popularity ratings, you barely get to 55%. You know, Starmer is at about 20%, Macron 23%, and Merz, who just won the election, at 28%. So none of these leaders are popular if they go with bigger defense budgets for a war that's lost. They're dooming their governments. And I think this is where Trump realizes he has an upper hand. And then you see the kind of bitterness, like today in the British Parliament, one of the senior conservative figures said it's time to consider whether Trump is a Russian agent. So the old Russiagate stories are coming out. So there's an unhinged quality to the debate, but there's a real danger, because the other part of this, John, is that they're talking about a Franco-British nuclear umbrella for Europe to replace the US umbrella. Now, first of all, the British side of this is largely in the hands of the United States. Their main nuclear force are the Trident missiles, which are on lease to them from the United States. which they have to go to the US for maintenance and for targeting. So it's hardly an independent force. I don't think Macron can get the French military to be willing to risk Paris to save Kiev. So there's a lot of bluster. But the main thing is we're heading into a completely uncharted territory. And the quality of thinking from Europe is not very good.
When we last talked, we were talking about the people who make the economic decisions, and you pictured them with piles of cocaine in front of them, with that going on during these high-level meetings. And I wonder if that doesn't have a bit of an effect upon the decision making that sounds so crazy, like they're living in a make-believe world in which they always win everything. And the people of Europe deserve to have leadership that recognizes reality. I've thought for a long time that all national leaders and Congress people and everybody should have to take drug tests regularly, because there's so much drugs out there, even in the White House last presidency, that how can we rely on sensible leadership with people like Zelensky? Remember Ardern in New Zealand, and they're always, sniffing their noses and everything. I am sick and tired of it. We spoke about this a couple of weeks ago, and I wonder, if these people aren't just in some drug-induced dream world.
Well, it's possible. I mean, there are rumors that Zelensky has a spoon up to his nose quite often. I don't know for certain. I can tell you that there's a lot of drugs in Brussels at the European Parliament. But the bigger problem is, if you have people going to school at Oxford and London School of Economics and the Sorbonne, maybe you don't need cocaine to have them go crazy, because what they're being inculcated with is a mixture of a French existentialism with British Hobbesian worldview. And when they look at Russia, what they see is the Leviathan. They impose on Putin the Hobbesian idea that Putin uses force and intimidation, when they don't see that that's what they're doing. Kit Clarenberg has a new article out on the Gray Zone about what the British are doing to suppress all the free speech. And it's really quite frightening. And this is, of course, what J.D. Vance brought up at Munich, at the Munich Security Conference. And the Europeans went crazy. Who are you to lecture us? And they actually did have a certain point, because don't forget, the Trump administration is trying to silence opposition to Netanyahu. So censorship exists everywhere on all sides. But the point is, that's the way they think they can control things. And if you can't feed people, if you can't guarantee them jobs and healthcare, then you don't have to have some alternative inducement to demonstrate, to go out into the streets. People are really suffering. The problem they have is they don't know where to turn. Now, if you saw the outcome in Germany, if you look at a map of Germany where they have the Christian Democrats, total was in red, the AfD was in blue, the whole of Eastern Germany was blue.
Right.
Here's the irony. This is the former communist section of Germany, Eastern Germany. And they're voting for the Alternative for Deutschland, which the media says is a right-wing Nazi movement. And the people from East Germany say, no, the Nazis are on the other side. So you have a broken discourse. And we see the same thing with Zelensky, when Zelensky says that you can't have peace with Putin because he's broken every agreement. Well, who's actually broken every agreement? It's been the West. And there was a very interesting video I saw today of an interview with Bill Clinton, I think it was a few years ago, asking if Putin ever lied to him, because he met with Putin quite a bit. And he said no. He said Putin was always straightforward. Now, I don't know where that video came from, but it's it's very interesting how this thing is moving so quickly.
I saw it too, and I thought that's pretty interesting. However, my opinion of Clinton's credibility has crumbled a lot in the last couple decades. So, but nevertheless, he seemed to be telling the truth. That he can make a deal with Putin.
Well,
Let me
Hillary, of course, said the opposite because Hillary, her view is that Putin is the new Hitler, and the only rival to Putin as the new Hitler is Trump.
I watched Jeffrey Sachs's speech at the European Union, I
Yeah,
think it was,
yeah.
and I was very impressed with his diagnosis. Although many of us have misgivings about listening to Sachs after his history with the Harvard International Development people and the Harvard boys back in the breakup of the Soviet Union, which you and I have talked about, but he's an intellectual, and and one of the things that stuck with me is that this is a kind of game playing, like from the Rand Corporation, and the game that they're playing is the one that says you don't negotiate with the other side ever. And so whatever happens, you make up something, to move the agenda forward. Kind of, you might have to go sideways or upside down or whatever, but you never ever give the other side the equal treatment. You always disregard what they say, even if it's stone cold truth. And they've been getting away with it, of course, because the media is completely controlled. So, but I don't know. Do you see that? Is this like part of a big tactic that's never going? They're never going to. It's like a wall that they've built around their brains that they're just not going to think beyond that wall.
Well, some of them aren't capable of it. They're trapped in an axiomatic framework that says Russia is the imperial power.
Yeah.
And this is deep inside the British establishment. Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Royal United Service Institute, they are filled with these Russophobes who are convinced that if you got rid of Putin and brought someone else in, he'd be just as bad. That there's no, it's the Russian national character is what this guy Keir Giles says, who's a Chatham House fellow. So some of this is just deeply embedded. But I want to go back to Sachs for a second because no one was more sharp against him in the early 90s than LaRouche. And I intervened on him at a couple of events. And one time I caught him I sort of tripped him up a little bit. And this was at Rice University. And I said, you know what LaRouche says about you? You prove there's no such thing as safe Sachs. And he laughed at that. But let me tell you something about him. He's reevaluating now some aspect of the early 90s. And part of that is I've sent him some of the work that I've done, which put together the memo from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in 1994, which said that shock therapy will destroy democracy in Russia. And that memo was suppressed. And even Sachs hadn't seen it. Sachs resigned before the shock therapy got really intense, before the demographic collapse happened, because he said that they weren't getting the money that they needed to actually have some therapy. It was all shock. The problem is he still defends Gaidar, who was the Russian golden boy of the Harvard school. But he is starting to turn on some of his Harvard colleagues. In one of the interviews I saw with him right before the EU event, he said that he's now seen some of the minutes of the NSC meetings that were discussing his proposal. And he said, I was shocked at how nasty my colleagues were towards me because they never expressed that to me in person. Now, whatever he was doing in the 90s, I think he's atoning for that now because he's one of the clearest voices Besides, I would say what we're doing and saying, one of the clearest voices on this question, along with Scott Horton, that Russia was provoked, that it was not an unprovoked operation that launched the special military operation. And furthermore, the question of the consistent lying. But if you put together the chronology, John, what you see is the same time they lied about no eastward expansion of NATO, the West said that. And at the same time, they said, as Clinton said, we'll consider Russia for membership in NATO. As they were doing that, they were also imposing the shock therapy. And what was the intent of the shock therapy? Supposedly to turn Russia into a market economy, to transform it. But in reality, it was a land grab. It was a resource grab. It made billionaires in the West. And it made a couple of former KGB people oligarchs. Putin turned against those oligarchs. He said to them, if you're going to take the money from Russia, we're going to hunt you down. If you keep the money in Russia and build the country, we'll let you keep it. So in a sense, what we're seeing is a reckoning with this legacy of lies and provocations. And so it's very important when you have someone with the authority of Sachs that he's saying that, and that he's going on these programs and saying it. And it's now being repeated by others.
Yeah.
So I felt very much alone for many years in the LaRouche movement when we were saying that Russia was being provoked, Russia was being attacked. And they'd say, oh, what are you talking about? They're killing people in Chechnya. They're running operations. They're cutting underwater cables. They're doing chemtrails. They're doing everything.
Yeah.
And this element of truth coming from Sachs is very refreshing and necessary. And I just hope he stays healthy because he travels all over the world. And but the good news is he's been in touch with us to some extent, and he's open to that. And I think that's very important.
I want to ask you about a theory that hit me the other day, and it was when I heard Zelensky saying, well, it was reported that he said, fuck Trump. And but also he said something that led me to believe that his strategy is to get Europe involved in a shooting war so that we'll have to respond under Article 5 of the NATO treaty. In other words, he thinks he's got us outfoxed because even if we don't want to do it, we've got a treaty that says that we have to do it. And, with the help of our compliant legislators, that we could be told that we're forced to do it or otherwise drawn into this war. I think that raises the possibility, and, there's a lot of Trump has created a lot of anticipation for what he's going to do tonight. A big announcement from Donald Trump tonight. Stay tuned. Details later. I wonder if he's going to take us out of NATO.
Well, there are rumors to that effect. I just had one of my German contacts send me a note saying, what do you make of the rumors that Trump is going to pull the U.S. out of NATO? Look, Elon Musk has said we should get out of NATO.
Yeah.
Senator Mike Lee from Utah, who's very close to Trump, has said that. And Jack Matlock, the Reagan ambassador to Russia, who's a very honest man, has said NATO's purpose died when the Soviet Union dissolved peacefully. And he said we should have declared victory and dismantled it at that point, or turned it into some kind of something different, which would have included Russia. So there's a lot of this kind of talk going on. The problem with that analysis about what Zelensky wants to do is there are two problems. One, Western European countries are probably not going to send troops. The idea that the French would send troops, I think Macron floated that and got hit pretty hard by the French military. Starmer doesn't have troops to send. I mean, they fall short in their recruiting. Someone told me they can't fill Wembley Stadium with the size if they had their whole army there. But then the other thing is, if you do try to force the issue of Article 5 to bring the United States in, what do you gain from that? You get a nuclear war.
Yeah, you do. And there
Yeah.
are people that want that, I believe.
Well, there are some people who think that you can win a nuclear war with Russia, but I think they're in the minority in the military. Uh, Biden was surrounded by people who believe that. People like Blinken and Sullivan, who were these privileged characters who figured they had their bomb shelters prepared for 6 months to 2 years if there was a nuclear war. Uh, and there may be some people like that in the Trump administration. But I think on the whole, what we're seeing, if you listen to people like Mike Waltz or Hegseth, who seem to be anti-Russia hawks before, or Marco Rubio, they're now working with Trump in a way that's, to me, almost shocking. To hear Marco Rubio talking about a multipolar world, working
I
with Russia
know. I
and
know. That
China.
was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
So I
and
think,
I think, to say that, we are now in a multipolar world is like, that just shakes the foundation of American foreign policy since World War II.
well, but that's what we're seeing, John. What we're seeing, if you get outside of the media bubble in the United States and also in Europe, because it's just as bad in Europe, the rest of the world is looking at the post unipolar order. They see the US pulling back from that. Now, Trump is somewhat of a mixed character on this because on the one hand, I think he's genuine when he says he doesn't want to see killing going on. He wants to see these wars stopped. He's written before and talked before about the influence of his father's brother on him. His father's brother was involved in the original Manhattan Project nuclear program and told him that if you have a nuclear war, that's the end of humanity. And I think Trump is somewhat genuine, in fact, very genuine when he says he doesn't want these wars. Now, on the other hand, you can see how he's ambiguous at best on the Southwest Asia, the Gaza situation, supporting Netanyahu. So there's always a potential caveat there. But then you also have the people in the military who are now briefing someone like Rubio, briefing uh, Waltz and the others, who are essentially telling them nuclear war is not an answer. You can't win a nuclear war. So, if that's understood, and the choice is either you have constant wars like Ukraine, that wars of attrition, or you have peace. And I think this is where you can see the potential for the real change, the tectonic shift that Putin was talking about. And that's the first thing I thought when I saw Rubio saying we're in a multipolar world. Not we need it, we're actually in it. When I heard that from Rubio, I said, wow, that is a shift.
Yes, and the only thing that is still, of course, and I guess it will always be bothering me and thousands and millions of other people, is the Trump policy toward Gaza and
Yep.
Israel. All of this back and forth about Zelensky is covering the newspapers up with those headlines. What's going on behind the scenes? Can you tell us as far as between Trump and Netanyahu, and any progress on trying to work out a peaceful settlement?
Well, today in Cairo, there's a meeting on the Egyptian project. And this is Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, some of the countries with the largest national wealth funds in the world. And they're talking about a major reconstruction program for Gaza, which is not like that Disney World, Trump and Netanyahu fantasy cartoon. Did you see that video?
No.
Well, there's a video where it looks like Disneyland, beaches, uh, cheerleaders, people sipping cocktails on the Mediterranean.
Yeah, I can picture it.
No, I think that was maybe a spoof, but here's what I'm hoping. And I can't by any means cite evidence that it's absolutely true. But when Trump talked about taking over Gaza, he did something that had not happened for a long time, which is he provoked the Arab world into coming to their feet and say, okay, we'll do something about this. And the Saudis were involved. The Saudis would like nothing more than to have peace now in the Middle East. And for them, there's a recognition you can't do it without having a Palestinian state. Jordan has the same thing. Jordan has over, I think, close to 2 million Palestinian refugees living there since 1948. And it's a potentially unstable situation. The Egyptians are looking at the possibility of 1 million or more Palestinians being thrown into Egypt. And so the Arab countries took Trump's statement on Gaza as an opportunity to step forward and say, okay, we'll come up with some solutions. Now, we'll see what comes out of the meeting in Cairo. I don't have a report on it yet. But what they're talking about is transport corridors, redevelopment of the area, no exclusion of Palestinians. That is, no ethnic cleansing, no Netanyahu solving the Palestinian problem by getting rid of the Palestinians. They're saying the Palestinians should have a right to return and return to communities that are nice, that are safe, that have water, that have electricity. And the only thing missing from it is a policy that then would plug that into a two-state solution with Israel, which is what our proposal for the Oasis Plan does. Because the Oasis Plan would provide water for Palestine and Israel. But I think whether Trump intended it or not, his intervention forced the Arab countries to step forward with a plan. Now, this is where you get to the real crux of the problem. That's not a plan that Netanyahu can wrap his arms around. Netanyahu's finished as soon as Israel's out of a war. And he's still looking to keep troops in Syria. In fact, Israel's planning to demilitarize the area between the Golan Heights up to Damascus. He's still insisting on a need to go to war with Iran. And this is where, if Trump is serious about no war, he's going to have to do something with Netanyahu. Now, Witkoff, the person who went to Netanyahu and got him to agree to the ceasefire, is supposedly working on some things for a trip to Israel next week. One thing I like about Witkoff was the report that we got when he contacted Netanyahu before the inauguration and said he was going to come to see him to talk about a ceasefire. And he said, I'll see you tomorrow. And that tomorrow would have been a Saturday. So Netanyahu said, oh, no, we never do business on the Sabbath. And Witkoff, who's Jewish, said, I'll be in your office at 1 o'clock. You'd better be there. And Netanyahu showed up, and the result was this somewhat flawed, but a breathing space for the Palestinians of a ceasefire. Now, the problem is you have a growing section of the population in Israel that's now moving into the streets against Netanyahu. So what's Netanyahu going to do? The latest thing that happened, and this I have from some people in the Israeli peace movement, is this family, the Bibas family, when they had the bodies returned, and Netanyahu tried to turn that against Hamas. And in fact, members of the family blamed Netanyahu. And this is increasingly the case. The hostage families are holding Netanyahu responsible for the deaths of the hostages. And it just came out a couple of days ago that an 11-year-old girl who was killed supposedly when the Hamas invaded on the 7th was run over by an Israeli tank. So more of these stories are coming out. The question is it possible in Israel that you could have a grouping of some sort that would move against the war? Now, one thing, John, I'm doing some research now on a Israeli military historian, Bar Joseph, who's very interesting, who is saying that the problem with Israel is not that it has security failures or intelligence failures. Those things happen and they may actually not be failures, they may be intentional. He said the problem in Israel is the refusal to negotiate in good faith. And he, in a recent article, said 70% of the retired military officials agree with that. And even though they don't trust the Palestinians, they're saying a two-state solution is necessary. Now, if you have the military and security forces in Israel saying that, that's a fairly powerful potential break against Netanyahu's desire to do an ethnic cleansing. Is it enough? Well, this gets back to what you were asking. What will Trump do? And I can't give you an answer to that. I don't know. When you listen to him talk, sometimes you think he's Bibi Netanyahu's best friend, but then you read between the lines and you see that he's been very critical of Netanyahu at times. So I think his strategy is finish the Ukraine war and then turn toward the Abraham Accords. And you're not going to get the Abraham Accords unless you do something decent for the Palestinians. And I don't just mean end the genocide. I mean build up a possibility for a prosperous future for the several million people who have been held under the occupation of the Israelis.
I'm not familiar with the Abraham Accord in detail. Could you give us a brief outline?
Sure. This was, I think it was Jared Kushner's idea, working with some people around Mohammed bin Salman. The question was, how do you get a rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia? And some of this was based on the idea that the Saudis, as largely Sunni Muslims, were seen to be the natural enemies of the Shia, the Iranians. So if you could bring an alliance of Israel and Saudi Arabia, you could deal with the Iranian problem. Now, in order to do that, they were proposing that there be a pact, an agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia for mutual recognition and economic cooperation and so on, which could include the Emirates, could include Egypt, and the broader Arab world, but the Saudis would be the first to do it. And supposedly they were getting close to that in the period before October 7th. Now, once October 7th happened, the Saudis could not drop their animosity towards Israel officially, could not set up an embassy and welcome the Zionist state. They had to side with the Arabs, but they didn't do much. So now we see this question coming up of what would be the basis for a real peace between the Arab world and the Israelis. And it would have to be on the basis of economic cooperation and development. And so that was what the Abraham Accord was about. Now, what's changed since it was first brought up, this was from Trump's first term, the idea of the Abraham Accord. What's changed is that Iran and Saudi Arabia are no longer great enemies. And that's because the Chinese came in. And the Chinese brought a rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, it's not been fully tested. No one knows how long it will hold. Then there's also the other factor is Turkey, because Turkey is somewhat at odds with the Saudis in terms of the overall situation in the Middle East, including what happens in Syria. And there's some discussion now. Netanyahu just sent one of his top advisors to Russia to talk about Syria, in which the Israelis were telling the Russians, you can keep your bases in Syria. And so then the question is, will Turkey accept that? So there are all these complications. But the key to the Abraham Accords is it can't just be a real estate development, according to what Kushner wants. It has to be based on mutually beneficial economic relations. And that's going to be the proof of a rapprochement will be if that occurs. And Israel needs help now also because the Israeli economy is very much affected by this. What is it now? 16 months, 17 months of war. So, there may be openings to pursue this.
It would be wonderful for the world to see peace in the Middle East. However, it's, as we talk about so many times, it's such a crossroads of human economic activity, as well as, every generation faces something in the Middle East. And will Saudi, I guess Saudi is resolved to allowing Israel to exist now. Is that true?
Well, the Saudis are looking at the future. Mohammed bin Salman is from a totally different generation than the previous Saudi leaders, who were either the direct sons of King Saud, who the country was named after, or the grandchildren. Now you have a younger generation that is looking at the potential for wealth. And on the one side, you see the gaudy Abu Dhabi, Doha, the building of these giant skyscrapers in the middle of the desert, and
Yeah.
ski. They're talking about a ski resort in the Saudi desert. I mean, with a lot of money, you get crazy ideas. But they're also talking about wanting nuclear power so they don't have to become dependent forever on oil. And so this is something that the Chinese and the Russians are talking to them about, the thorium reactors, high temperature gas cooled reactors that don't go through a plutonium cycle. So there's this kind of change underway. And I think the old idea of how to control the Middle East was from Bernard Lewis and then Brzezinski and Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations. And that's where they say the Shia and the Sunnis have a history going back to 700 AD of fighting over which is the true progeny of the Prophet Muhammad. And many people have died over that. But before we cast aspersions on the Arab people, how many Christians died in Europe in the Protestant Catholic wars, the 30 Years' War, for example? So you have these kinds of fault lines which are used to control nations, to force them into short-term alliances with other forces that are basically using these alliances to go in and steal their wealth. And so the Saudis are trying to figure it out. The Iranians are trying to figure it out. It's a moment of change that would benefit from such projects as the Belt and Road Initiative coming into the region as the crossroads. From the positive side, what you're saying is the crossroads in the past have always been sort of a negative.
Yeah.
The Europeans trying to protect their routes, their land and sea routes. Well, what if those became positive connections? The connection of Asia with Europe and Africa through the Middle East. And this is what is the possibility now with the Belt and Road Initiative. So, maybe this is why if Trump talks to Putin, Putin will say to him, go talk to Xi Jinping also. And Trump has said that with Putin and Xi Jinping, you could have two partners with the United States that could achieve a peaceful solution to many of these crises. The question is, how do you avoid having like three empires that are competing?
Exactly.
And instead have, and the example I use is if you look at Yalta, we just celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Yalta talks, where you had Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. And these were largely dominated by FDR's view of the post-war world, which led to the United Nations, the Bretton Woods system, the rebuilding of the destruction of Europe and Japan. And it had a real positive, which then a few months later, after Roosevelt's death, you had the Potsdam Conference, and that was dominated by Churchill, who wrapped Harry Truman around his fingers. And so much of what Roosevelt was trying to do was lost. And what people don't appreciate is that Roosevelt was intensely anti-colonial. And he said to Churchill, according to his son, who sat at the dinner table with them, "Never again, Winston, will American boys die for the British Empire." And Elliott Roosevelt said Churchill turned purple. But they had that discussion every night for, I think, a month when Churchill was living in the White House. Now, when Roosevelt was gone, Churchill grabbed on to Truman and was able to manipulate him. And so the full effect of what Roosevelt was trying to do with the four freedoms, with the United Nations, was somewhat blunted. But it was a better period. You did have Reconstruction. You didn't have the Versailles World War, post-World War I, a policy of retribution against the other powers. So what if you actually had leaders who saw themselves not as representing blocks of power, but the potential for collaboration among sovereign states? It doesn't mean you don't have competition, but it means the competition is who can do the best for their nation and for other nations that trade with them. And that's the whole question of human nature. Can we overcome greed and corruption? And this is where you can't rely on political leaders. You have to have a population that asserts its will. And that's what LaRouche has always said, is the problem is that the American population has done well enough in the post-World War II period that it didn't want to mess with the international, the intricacies and the complexities of international politics. They left that to the establishment, and the establishment is where you have the corruption.
And getting back to what Jeffrey Sachs was saying, that the U.S. has farmed out its Middle East policy to Israel, and that happened. I don't remember which president it was under, but according to Sachs, that we don't exert Middle East policy. We just wait to see what Israel wants to do, and we support them. Why? Because of I think a lot of our Congress has been captured, and certainly, there's influence on Trump as well. So there's that the Middle East problem. But I want to get
John,
back.
if you go back to FDR,
Yeah,
he had enormous influence on Eisenhower. And Eisenhower was the one who stepped forward in 1956 at a crucial moment and told the British, the French, and the Israelis to get out of Egypt. And he threatened the British with dumping the US pound sterling notes. And the Brits turned tail and ran immediately. And Eisenhower then was the one who, in a sense, doubled down on that by talking about the military-industrial complex. Who is he talking about? He's talking about not just the defense contractors, but the whole nexus, which includes lawyers, which includes bankers. And he passed that on to JFK. And Kennedy showed that he understood that in June of 1963, when he issued Executive Order 11110, taking the creation of money temporarily away from the Federal Reserve and giving it to the Treasury. So that was a fight that was reverberating until after Kennedy was killed, and then after Nixon broke the Bretton Woods Agreement on August 15th, 1971. Now, since then, we've been living under a speculative world in which people like George Soros determine the value of currencies, that private bankers like the Larry Finks and the Jamie Dimons have more power than the Treasury Secretary or even the president when it comes to economic policy. And unfortunately, from what I can tell, Trump's Treasury Secretary, Bessent, is a speculator. He was a top official of the Soros organization. He led the attack on the pound in the late 80s, and he led the attack on the yen in 2013. Made a couple $1 billion for the Soros Group and disrupted the whole international trade and commerce. Now, he's one of the supposed supporters of the idea of the Bitcoin, of the crypto reserve. Now, to me, from all I can gather from reading so far, this is an attempt to roll over the debt and to use a certain amount of private fortunes and more derivatives to provide liquidity to avoid bankruptcy of the US government and of major corporations. We're going to put together a task force in the next couple of days to look into it and figure out exactly what's going on. But I'm very concerned that this is the weak spot, the weak flank of Trump. And just one final point on that. The London Economist had an article on Sunday in their Sunday issue on how terrible it is that Starmer's been turned into a laughingstock, that the London meeting didn't work after Zelensky, that there's little option for Europe. But he sort of brightened at that point and said, there are early warning signs of economic weakness in the United States. And then he went through the housing markets, the debt, a whole bunch of these points. And what you could see in that is how are the British thinking they can get back into the game? Play on the weakness of the Americans when it comes to money. Because the Americans, to the extent the Americans actually believe in Keynes and believe in monetary policy, they can be induced to go into these boom and bust cycles where they no longer have the vast amount of economic power that they had before World War II, thanks to Roosevelt's 1930s economic and industrial reforms. So, we got to watch this very carefully because you cannot trust the British. Ray McGovern always says that his grandfather told him, you know why the sun never sets on the British Empire? Because God didn't trust the British in the dark.
I like that. I'm not sure I trust him in the daytime. Yeah. Well, what would you advise Europe to do now? I mean, I think you've got very few choices. You can either come crawling back to Trump and say, we want to do whatever Trump says. We're now Trumpians and we want to, yay Trump. Or do you go to Putin and say, "Oh, let's do business. Let's open up the pipelines. Let's rebuild Europe on the oil that comes from Russia"? Or do you do what Jeffrey Sachs advised them to do, and that is to have your own foreign policy, have your own army, build up an army, and be a country? But I don't think Europe is a country. I think Europe is a bureaucratically combined bunch of nations that don't have the same interest, but have been forced to pretend that they're all on the same page in order to survive up to now. But or the last one would be to just say, the hell with Europe. Let's all just go our own way. I'll be Britain, you be Italy, and we'll all go our own way, and we'll go back to Westphalia and not bother each other anymore. Let's just be, now that's a balkanization in a way, the kind of thing that we didn't want to happen when the Habsburg Empire broke down. So that can't be the answer either. So there you go. What's the answer?
All right. You start with what's the problem. The problem is that if you look at why the United States worked, when you took these 13 colonies and then kept adding more and more area, you had one aspect of a national government that was committed to a credit policy, which included investment in infrastructure, investment in science and technology, in credit to increase the productive power of labor, and therefore build a potential for a rising middle class. And despite antagonism that existed from time to time between states or between states and the federal government, for the most part, it worked until we got into the last 50, 60 years. Now, Europe didn't have that. The European Union took away from nations the right to generate credit and have a policy for their own economic investment. And they relied largely on Germany as the engine. The German economy, without the Deutschmark giving way to the euro, there never would have been a European Union. And they convinced the Germans that they had to accept the Maastricht Treaty, the euro, give up the Deutschmark, and underwrite this federal Europe, which was not a republic. I mean, Brussels is run by non-elected bureaucrats.
Exactly.
It makes Washington look like a study of Republican institutions. And we know Washington has been corrupted, but in Brussels, Ursula von der Leyen, her husband was a lobbyist for Pfizer. So the president of the European Commission made a fortune from the COVID situation. So, you look at that and you see that the European Union does not allow sovereignty for any nation. So that's part of the problem. But how do you deal with that now? I'd say the first thing that Europe has to do is make it clear to Zelensky, either he goes for negotiations or there's not going to be any more support for Ukraine. This has nothing to do with Trump or Putin. It has to do with Europe. Europe is putting itself in the firing line by saying they're going to continue. Ursula von der Leyen said 800 billion euros in a defense and security policy toward Ukraine. So the first thing to do is say to Zelensky, we agree with Trump now. You've got to end this war. Now, then it's not a question of supporting Trump or Putin. You support your own country. You look at what's needed. Every one of these countries has problems. But where are you seeing progress? Well, I have to tell you, I was totally impressed by my brief trip to Hungary last week, where I saw a nice city. Budapest is a beautiful city. People are out at night. There's hardly policemen anywhere. Crime is low. People are employed. They may not be rich, but they're enjoying life. And they have a sense that their country has a certain national purpose and adherence to tradition that gives people a meaning for life. Now, there's no reason that couldn't be restored in Germany or France. Instead of seeing Macron orienting towards Starmer. I mean, remember, the British are out of the European Union. So they're still in NATO. But to make a long story short, the solution is you have to have governments in these countries that will act together, but act together not for military or defensive purposes, but for improving the conditions of life for their populations and working with their neighbors. That's the Peace of Westphalia isn't just non-interference in other nations. It's cooperation with other nations. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's sort of a golden rule for countries. And that was what Washington in his farewell address said the United States should do. That's what John Quincy Adams, one of the most consequential U.S. presidents, said we should do. Don't go abroad looking for dragons to fight. Develop your own country, but do it in a way that's cooperative with other countries. So that shouldn't be such a difficult thing. We look at what China's doing now with the Belt and Road Initiative, what Russia and China are doing in Africa to help the final decolonization of that continent. That's the kind of mission the United States, that's what Kennedy wanted to do with USAID, and instead it got turned into an arm of the CIA for covert operations. By the way, John, I think I sent you the article I just wrote on that. If people are interested, you can go to the LaRoucheOrganization.com and get my article on what's going on with USAID. because this is the center of the color revolution operation that was set up under Obama, actually Bush, Obama, and Biden. So you get rid of those kind of things, have open discussion, cooperation. You can solve these things. It's going to take a while, but we better get to work on it now.
Well, the globalists, Alex Jones and his many followers are always screaming about the globalists, and I think that's really is again it's just like the Oasis plan that you guys have been pushing for so long, and it's a beautiful plan, and I have a copy of the text of it that I got from the EIR printing. It's a beautiful plan. It looks great. The problem is that there's no will. There's no will to do it. And as we spoke about the many reasons, I can't help but think back to the foundation of Israel, because what they thought they were getting, what they wanted to have, would be a blank slate.
John, remember this? I mentioned this historian Bar Joseph.
Yeah.
What he said is the tragedy of Israel is that it was created to provide a safe place for Jews. Right now, it's the most dangerous place in the world for Jews because of the Israeli policy. And that's something that is up to Israel's leaders to think about. It's a very ironic formulation.
Well, I think the march towards one world government is not going to stop today. However, the factors that we talk about, especially with Trump throwing his weight around, and these tariffs, for instance, and I know we got to wrap it up, but any comment on the 25% tariffs going into effect against I think against a lot of countries that just happens today. A lot of people were calling it bluff.
It's going to be inflationary. The idea that it's going to give us income, that's why when he talks about McKinley and the American system, it was not about making money. It was about defending American industry and agriculture from predatory opponents. And the idea that you use it to make money, I think that's a form of corruption.
It sounds like a huge mistake for the United States then, if it's going to fail.
Well, we've got to do something to change some of these policies. I think Trump is moving in the right direction on Ukraine. I think his weak flank is economics, and maybe if he would read The Economist once in a while, he'd see that they're gunning to bring down the United States. What we should do is break the special relationship. That's the starting point. Special relationship with Britain.
We've gone a long way down that road already.
Yeah.
And, boy, I would be so happy to see America be America again, and remember our roots and why we left in the first place.
And look at Gabbard. Gabbard made a beautiful statement about the British trying to force Apple to open up to the British spying. Yeah. She put out a good, strong statement, and maybe she'll actually stick to what she said she was going to do.
Well, Harley, thank you so much for another very interesting hour, and I'm looking forward to see what Trump says tonight. I know a lot of people will be watching, and gosh, I just hope we can let's have some peace in the world.
Good idea.
All right. Thanks again, Harley. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks, and all the best. Until then. Bye-bye.
Good. Bye.
Everybody. We'll see you guys on Thursday with George Webb. See you then.